So hello and welcome to this session on revolutionary ideas. What is a revolutionary party? We're joined today by Alex Snowdon, who is going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. Alex is a long-standing Counterfire member, an activist who's based in the Northeast, and he's a regular contributor to the Counterfire website. When he finishes speaking, if you wish to contribute or ask a question, please use the raise hand function, and I'll ask everybody to keep their questions and contributions reasonably brief, for a couple of minutes, please. So now I think over to you, Alex, and we can begin.
Thank you, Tarina. Thank you everyone for joining this session. As Tarina said, if you're in the Russian Revolution session in the previous slot, there's very good continuity with this one, but also if you're in Lindsay's session on class and class consciousness, this is part of the same course. Now, some of you might be following that course and have taken part in the previous meetings, some might not. I am going to refer a number of points to some of the ideas that have already been outlined by John, Susan and Lindsay in the previous sessions, partly because I don't want to take certain things for granted in this sort of concluding part of that course, and just to make things absolutely clear. What I'm really going to do is to outline the Marxist case for revolutionary socialist organisation, for independent revolutionary organisation, and to explain why I think that is necessary, why it makes a difference, and to sort of locate that in the Marxist tradition. I also want to say a little bit about some of the historical experience of building revolutionary organisation, and I will be unashamedly selective there. I will, for reasons of time, I suppose, just focus briefly on one particular example, the most important, the most significant example from history, which is the role that the Bolshevik Party played before 1917, before the revolutionary upheavals of 1917, in Russia, and in particular, the role of Lenin in that. And I'll conclude by saying a little bit, but not much, about the contemporary relevance. So for the most part, it's at a fairly theoretical and historical level, but I do want to say a little bit about where we in Counterfire see ourselves in relation to this tradition and this set of ideas, and the relevance to what we are doing today in the project that we are engaged in today. I do think a number of steps are required to go through theoretically before even addressing the question of organisation. How do we organise? What kind of organisation do we need? There are certain assumptions politically that we need to think about and talk about before we get to that question of how we organise. Three in particular, I think, we need to go through. So I want to outline these. And these are linked to some of the ideas that have already been talked about in the previous sessions. So the first one is revolutionary organisation is rooted in having an anti-capitalist perspective. So what I mean by this is the recognition that capitalism as a system is the source of the many different problems, however diverse and separate those problems might appear to be, but it is the root cause, it's the source of those many different problems that we face. So a class society of exploitation, one that feeds different forms of oppression, and specifically in the last couple of 100 years, the version of class society, the form of class society that we've had of capitalism, is at the root of the challenges that we face. And as Susan Newman explained in her session yesterday on capitalist crisis, capitalism cannot resolve those problems. It cannot resolve its own contradictions. Those contradictions and recurring crisis and all the problems generated by the system are inherent in capitalism. They are built into capitalism. And Lindsay quoted earlier a famous line from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto in 1848, in the early stages of the development of industrial capitalism, when they said the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So class struggle has been one of the things that has driven history, how history is developed, and is inevitable within capitalism. Capitalism is a class society. It generates divisions and tensions, particularly at the heart of the system in the workplace. And so class struggle, which takes different forms, is absolutely built in to the system. The second thing that I think is crucial to grasp is that for us, the alternative to capitalism, of course, is a socialist society. And what that means is really the opposite of the key features that characterize a capitalist system, a system that is driven by competition between different businesses, by competition between different nation states, and of course, the kind of competition and the divisions and the inequalities that go with that throughout society. So socialism is about a cooperative way of living. It's about cooperation rather than competition in terms of how we run economic life and social life. It's about equality rather than the appalling inequality that capitalism breeds. And fundamentally, it's about democracy. A socialist society is a radical version of democracy. We, in reality, have a rhetorical commitment to democracy in sort of liberal capitalist societies. And underneath that, real power still rests with the ruling class, with a tiny minority, with those who are the owners of capital and those who are linked to them. So democracy is absolutely the heart of socialism. So when we talk about the kind of organization that we need, when we come on to that, it's rooted in opposition to capitalism and the idea that capitalism needs to be overthrown rather than being able to work within capitalism, and the idea that socialism is the alternative to that. The final point to make is, of course, that leaves a massive question open, doesn't it? Which is, we have capitalism, we want socialism. How do we get from one to the other? What is the bridge between them? What are the means of social change, of social transformation? And that requires thinking about who can create that social change and how that change can come about. And the answer that Marx gave, and these answers are absolutely integral to what made Marx innovative in the 19th century, as well as his analysis of capitalism and of class. He argued two things. One, that it is the working class that is the agents of social transformation. The working class are not simply the victims of capitalism, but also the force, the social and political force that has the potential to build society anew. And that can only be done through revolution. Revolution is an active process. It's not a single event. It's not something from above. It's not something that can be wished into being. It is a process involving mass action by working class people. And it's probably best seen as the highest form of class struggle. Class struggle is always going on in some form or another on whatever scale. It's endemic to capitalism. And capitalism creates, as Marx argued, its own gravedigger. The gravedigger is, as he put it, the proletariat, so the working class. Lindsay used a great quote from Engels in her session when Engels said, "The executioner stands at the door." The executioner for capitalism is the working class. So capitalism creates its own gravedigger or its own executioner, in Engels' wonderful phrase. And that stands at the door bit I like as well, because it's that sense that there is always that latent threat, that potential for the working class. However remote revolution often seems, that potential for the working class to challenge the ruling class, to challenge capitalism, and to potentially overthrow it. So a key part of that revolutionary perspective that puts the emphasis on working class self-activity is a rejection of reformism. So reformism is not simply the same as fighting for reforms. Revolutionaries do that. And in fact, Rosa Luxemburg, the great Polish revolutionary and Marxist who wrote the pamphlet Reform or Revolution, which is very much a rejection of reformism, Rosa Luxemburg argued that revolutionaries, in fact, are the most intransigent, the most uncompromising, the most reliable fighters for reforms. But reformism as a political project is inadequate because its ultimate goal is merely to reform capitalism. Now, if we accept the first proposition, which I put forward, which comes from Marx, that capitalism is precisely the problem, and that capitalism cannot resolve its contradictions. We cannot have a crisis-free, equal, cooperative, democratic capitalism. Then we need to overthrow capitalism through revolutionary change. And reformism is not geared towards that goal. Reformism is an expression of working class aspirations for something better, but very much within the constraints, within the limits of the capitalist system. And it is therefore an inadequate perspective. And Marx had a great line capturing the essence of all of this, which was that the emancipation, so the freedom or the liberation, the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. So this idea of self-emancipation is at the heart of Marxism, and therefore the heart of any project to build revolutionary organization rooted in that tradition. It's the working class that is responsible for this social transformation, both because it is the class that suffers from capitalism and is forced into revolt against it, but also because, due to being the majority of society and due to being organized collectively and socially, coming together at work, it is the class that has the collective power through being workers to challenge and ultimately to overthrow capitalism. And the self-emancipation is required, both because it is only revolution that can overthrow capitalism. It cannot be reformed away through acts of parliament or whatever else. But also, just as importantly for Marx, is the idea that it's self-emancipation that transforms people's own ideas and people's own consciousness. One of the sort of riddles, one of the tricky things that we were wrestling with in the session that Lindsay introduced before was precisely this whole thing of contradictory class consciousness. People have very contradictory ideas, and part of that is what Marx called the muck of ages, all the vile prejudices and backward ideas, the racism and the sexism and the nationalism and so on, that is part of living in and growing up in a capitalist society. People can reject that to a certain extent without struggle, but actually large sections of the population are only likely to reject such ideas precisely through collective struggle. So there's that vision of socialism and of human liberation coming through working class self-activity, and it's through that activity that people transform their own perceptions, their own ideas, their own relations with each other, and so on. So in that context, we come to the question of organization. And here, as I've said, we already have a core contradiction, don't we? Because workers are responsible for changing society, fantastic, but workers' ideas are shaped by capitalism. There is, however, a tension in terms of whether people accept those ideas or not. And revolutionaries need to think about at all times how to connect with that contradictory consciousness and how to nurture and develop the kind of class consciousness where the working class has consciousness, as Lukács put it, the Hungarian Marxist, to become a class for itself, rather than simply a class in itself with all the contradictory ideas of living in capitalism, but a class with a sense of its own interests, a class with a sense of its own power, a class for itself, that kind of positive, even revolutionary class consciousness. And one of the things that means for revolutionaries when we think about organization is that we have to build an organization that has uncompromising Marxist politics. That isn't one that tries to unite and bring together all sorts of different people with different ideas, but one that is rooted in that political tradition and does not bend opportunistically to the prevailing ideas. So Marxism is our guide, and it underpins, in a creative and dynamic way, of course, it underpins our political perspectives. But the second thing that is combined with, I think, is just as important. It is essential that any revolutionary organization is doing everything possible day after day to connect in practical terms, to connect with the struggles that are taking place. And those struggles will be partial, sectional, they will be often small scale or localized. They are not struggles to overthrow the system. But those struggles of all sorts, whether in the workplace, on the streets, in terms of protest movements and so on, and indeed the ideological debates and struggles that are going on, are what we have to root ourselves in. And they point the way towards revolutionary change. Every strike, however small, has at least a glimpse, a little glimpse of the kind of radical collective action that can change society. Every protest has a glimpse of that within it, a kind of germ of the possibilities of revolutionary transformation. So day in, day out, what we are doing is trying to unite people in action, and at the same time within that, trying to shape the ideological debates that are going on and build an organisation that has revolutionary socialist politics at its core. And resistance of one sort or another creates the space for doing that. It creates, in a sense, an audience of people who may be receptive to revolutionary ideas. And it might just be a small minority within a strike movement, within a protest movement and so on, a small minority who particularly respond to revolutionary socialist ideas. But nonetheless, it is those struggles that create the space and the possibility for attracting people to revolutionary organisation. There are two twin errors that kind of feed off each other that need to be avoided in all of this. One of them is sectarianism, which is standing aside from the real struggles that take place. And the other is opportunism, which is throwing yourselves into things in such a way that you completely abandon any principled politics and you simply bend towards the prevailing ideas in any particular movement. So a revolutionary organisation has to avoid those things. It is fundamentally about two tasks: the task to educate, to raise the political level, to generate political ideas, and also to organise. So to educate and to organise are really the twin tasks of a revolutionary organisation. And revolutionary organisations can at times, and I'm going to come on in a moment to say something about the Bolsheviks in relation to this, make an absolutely decisive difference if big enough and if rooted enough and if credible enough. If a revolutionary organisation has earned the trust and the respect of wide layers of working class people, it can make a decisive difference at times of revolutionary crisis. So this leads us on to the question of the Bolsheviks in the run up to 1917. But I would just stress before saying this, that this doesn't mean that the purpose of revolutionary organisation is simply to sort of prepare for a situation where there is revolutionary crisis and it's a day-by-day thing. You know, what is really crucial for us now, for example, in terms of those of us active in counterfire, is not so much some distant future, but it's about how do we intervene in the here and now? How do we intervene in the political debates and the real forms of resistance that are happening today? But I do want to say a little bit historically about the Bolsheviks, and there are a huge number of things that can be said about Lenin. Politically, there are a huge number of things that can be said about what the Bolsheviks did. And there were just two things that I really want to highlight, and I'm aware this is being very selective. The first, I mean, before mentioning these things, I should note that this is really the critical example to look at from history, precisely because what the Bolsheviks built before 1917 is linked to the direction and the course in many ways of 20th century history. The revolution of 1917 and what happened after that is the link between those. The fact is that the Bolsheviks played an absolutely critical and leading role in the revolutionary events of 1917 and shaped the outcomes in October 1917. And that led to the birth and the development of the first and so far only, I would argue, only workers' state in history. And so it's incredibly important, however badly things might have turned out with the rise of Stalinism in the 1920s, it is incredibly important to look at that historical experience. So the two things that I think that I want to highlight that were particularly important with the Bolsheviks, one was the basic idea that revolutionaries have to get stuck in to every manifestation of resistance to the system, whether it be in terms of demands for democracy and political rights, whether it be in the workplace over economic issues, whether it be opposition to anti-Semitism, other forms of racism, or anything else. It's important to be intervening. You don't simply, as a Marxist, discuss theory on the sidelines. There had been propagandist groups in this country, in Britain, in Russia and elsewhere, where essentially there was a very propagandist approach to how you do politics, standing aloof from strikes, for example. The Social Democratic Federation in this country in the 1880s and 1890s was quite a good example of one that very much saw its role as about propaganda, but you don't engage in that kind of wider working class activity so much. The Bolsheviks took a different approach. They got stuck in, they intervened, and they always sought to shape politically, to shape the struggles that were taking place. And of course, that required great tactical flexibility. It wasn't the case that you could write a manual which laid down everything that you need to do as a revolutionary. It meant being incredibly receptive to what was actually going on the ground, listening to workers, paying very close attention to the specific concerns that people had, to the way in which a movement was developing and so on. And the other thing I want to highlight is their incredibly sharp focus, their huge focus on publishing, in particular newspapers, of course, at that time. And so one thing we can think about this from this today and take from this is the importance of having ways of putting across socialist ideas in a hostile ideological climate, in a climate where ruling class ideas largely shape people's opinions. It's necessary to put across alternative ideas and to connect with the positive elements of the contradictory class consciousness that many workers had at the time. So raising the political level, carrying political arguments, winning people to socialist ideas, all of that was absolutely crucial. But those newspapers also had a very important function organizationally, not just ideologically. Actually selling for Bolshevik activists, selling the newspaper where they worked, selling the newspaper in their communities was a way of developing networks. So the process of producing and selling newspapers, the process of reporting on things that were happening and all the rest of it was absolutely essential for building an organization. The organization, in a sense, was created around the newspapers that the Bolsheviks were putting out there. So in terms of the contemporary relevance, I'll just finish. Great, thanks, Tarina. So I'll just finish in the last 2 minutes with this. What we are essentially trying to do on a very modest scale, we're an organization of a few hundred members in Counterfire, is to use those principles in a creative way today. And so we aim to both educate and to organize. We take ideas very seriously. We build on the Marxist tradition, but we also want to apply that to new situations. If you take the session we had earlier on, Is Britain Breaking Up? You cannot simply go back 150 years to something Marx wrote and have the answers to that kind of question. But it does help to be rooted in the Marxist tradition. If you understand what Marxists historically have said about nationalism, about the state and so on, then that provides a basis for the kind of analysis we need. But we're also about intervening. We're about getting stuck in. We're about trying to shape what is happening. You can see that, for example, with the role that Counterfire members played recently in the big Palestine demonstrations and with the People's Assembly demonstration on the 26th of June. So that is the sort of final note, I think, to end this on. I know there'll be a lot of questions and discussion, but this idea that we have to creatively combine sustaining a revolutionary tradition, a Marxist tradition, politically, ideologically, with building wider movements, building the trade unions, building workers' organisation and so on in a whole number of different ways. And I think that's a very useful starting point for thinking about how we organise today.